All right, after watching that super long video explaining vitals, here's another super long video of me explaining chemical diagnostics. So what we're going to take a look at are what are some of the different diagnostics that we can do, but this time involving, oh, my favorite thing in the world, chemistry. So let's take a look. So we're still kind of working on that same outcome. We're just really trying to figure out what are some of the tools and the ways that we actually diagnose medical conditions and keep an eye on them once we know that they're present. And these are actually probably things that almost everybody has had done at some point in their life, are chemical diagnostics, because they're one of the easiest and fastest ways to learn about what's happening inside the body. So a chemical diagnostic is basically a way of figuring out what's happening internally. So a way to actually know what's going on inside the body. And you can do this without cutting anybody open because you can actually analyze the chemistry of their body. If you think back to when we learned about things like nutrition, and so basically, you take in food, you take in O2, that goes to your cells. In your cells, they're going to metabolize. And once they metabolize, then they're going to excrete. And all of the things that they're actually doing here, every single one of these steps involves chemistry. And we would call this biochemistry because it is the chemistry of a living thing. And so what we can actually do is check your nutrition. We can check how well your cells are working in specific parts of your body. We can check how well your body's eliminating waste, all because we can check the chemicals that are present inside of your body in different places. And so one of the most common things that we would do is we would have a blood test. And a blood test is probably one of the most comprehensive diagnostic tools that we have, because think about all the things that are carried in your cardiovascular system, right? So this is just getting a sample of blood. And since your blood actually carries all this stuff, that's why it's so vital. Think about all the things that we learned that get carried inside of your blood, from food to waste to oxygen to carbon dioxide to hormones to minerals and vitamins and all these things that are going on, not to mention like blood cells, whether they're red or white and all that stuff, right? Now, to get blood, we use the process of phlebotomy. And somebody who is a phlebotomist is a person who is trained to draw blood. They always should draw blood from a vein. We do not stick a needle into your arteries to try and get blood back, or to get blood out, because then it would, rupturing an artery can cause major problems because of the higher pressure. And they're also thicker walled, right? Remember, an artery has thicker walls, so they're going to be tougher to get into than a vein that has the much thinner walls. You can, in some cases, depending on the amount of blood you need, use a capillary. This would be like when you prick someone's finger and you're just getting a very small sample of blood, but most likely you're drawing from a vein, and most likely they're going to draw from a vein in your arm because they're easily accessible. Now, needles freak me out. So you can see I did not include a picture. I hate phlebotomy and venipuncture, but I do see the value. I just wasn't going to make you look at somebody getting a needle, because it's too much for this guy to handle. Okay, so back to blood. Think about blood. Think about what we learned about blood. You have in the blood the blood plasma, right? So the majority of your blood is that plasma. And then you had all of the solids that are actually in that blood as well. So we're talking about like red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. I think there's an L in there. Okay. So you have all this information about like things that are carrying stuff through your body, but also remember what was actually in your blood plasma. In your blood plasma was the nutrients. It was the salts. It is the water. It is the wastes, hormones, not to mention things like antibodies. If you're getting like an antibody test. So there are so many things that are being carried throughout your blood. And so you can actually measure those things. You can actually go in, once you have a sample of blood, and check all of those levels. When you check those levels, it actually tells you how well certain organs are functioning. Because you know how well certain organs are functioning, you are able to actually get an idea of what might be wrong. You know, if maybe, let's say you do a check and you find hormone levels are low, or a specific hormone level is low, well, that tells you one organ that is releasing those might not be working quite as well. Or maybe there's a pituitary problem in the signaling of that organ. So you get a lot of ideas about what's happening just from the blood. Okay, I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but it's important that we actually know what some of the tests are when we go and get a blood test. And if you've ever gotten a blood test, you'll know they give you a big sheet and they'll actually like check boxes on that sheet. The doctor will say, I want a CBC and I want a platelet count and so on and so forth. And really that's just to help them get an idea of what's happening in certain organs. So we're going to start with a complete blood cell count. What they're checking here is every type of cell. They're basically counting all of the kinds of cells that are in there. Now, they're not sitting there and like counting them out individually one by one. They would do a small sample and then figure out what's going on in that sample and then basically like extrapolate from there, do some math and figure out what's happening. So by doing this, you can figure out, well, maybe there's like a low amount of red blood cells. That might mean there's not efficient enough iron, or maybe they're not shipping oxygen as well as they could. So that would be anemia. Maybe there are bacteria living inside the blood, and maybe the blood is infected, and that's a huge, super dangerous problem to have. Maybe their blood is clotting too well or not enough, and maybe that's a relation to their platelets. Maybe there's cancerous cells moving through their blood. Maybe the white blood cells are too high or too low, telling you about infections or immune system diseases. So looking for every type of cell can really give you a hint as to some major things that could be happening inside of the body. A really common thing to have done well is a red blood cell count or an RBC count. Basically, by figuring out how many red blood cells you have, you're looking at how well oxygen is flowing through your body. Remember, red blood cells carry oxygen, and so you can actually measure essentially how much oxygen is moving through your body. A white blood cell count, or WBC count, is measuring your white blood cells. This can show you about signs of infection. So if you have high white blood cell counts, really high white blood cell counts means you are fighting an infection. So let's say you thought you had the coronavirus. You went to the doctor, they give you the nose swab, but for some reason this doctor, he's like extra thorough and he gets a blood test too. And if you were infected, what they would see is that you have high white blood cells, all because of your immune response. So basically your body is amping up the production of white blood cells as it finds those things, you know, your B cells and your T cells, they're replicating and making lots of extra copies to go and fight this disease. And so that could be something that you look for too. But really low white blood cell counts can also be some huge indicators. If you have low white blood cells, it means you have low immune function. And so low immune function is a dangerous thing, right? It means that you're not going to be able to fight an infection very well. The other thing it might be is it might have to do with your bone health. Because white blood cells are made in the bone marrow, if there is like cancer of the bone, it lowers the amount of white blood cells that get produced. If you have some kind of bone issues or some bone problems or blood problems, then it might also be related to those. They may also look at things like thymus health, depending on like T cells, or they might look at like your spleen health or things like that. But most likely, low white blood cells are immune system deficiencies or bone marrow issues, sometimes even cancer. Another thing they can look for is your platelet count. Remember, platelets, their job is to clot the blood. And so having an abnormal amount of them will tell you about some sort of bleeding disorder. Basically, maybe you have something like hemophilia, which is when your blood doesn't clot. That is a genetic disorder. They might also, you might have like blood that is clotting too well. Basically, like your blood is too good at sticking together. And so that means that it is actually going to lead to things like blood clots, which could lead to strokes, and those can be extremely dangerous, and embolisms and things like that. Another thing they might look for is your hemoglobin. This is a protein that carries oxygen. So it is the thing that is actually in the red blood cells that is carrying the oxygen, is the hemoglobin. Hemo refers to iron because it has iron in it. And so you can actually measure the amount of iron by measuring the amount of hemoglobin. This is where the iron in your body goes. And so it shows you basically how well you're shipping oxygen in your blood, so that if you have low levels of oxygen shipment or low levels of iron, that's called anemia. And there's different kinds of anemia. And that might also tell you about some kind of blood disorders. So that could be something to look for too. Another thing they'll look for is called the hemocrit. So the hemocrit is basically looking at how much space the red blood cells are taking up. So how much space red blood cells take up in your blood. So it's kind of like the blood cell, so like red blood cell to plasma ratio. And kind of looking at like maybe you have low levels of water, maybe you aren't producing enough, and that means you have some kind of bone disorder that's not producing red blood cells. Maybe you're low on iron, so you're not producing enough red blood cells either. Maybe you have too many red blood cells, and so you're low on water or other things that would go into the plasma. And so that's kind of what a hemocrit is looking at. Basically, how much of your blood is red blood cells. The other thing we can look at is called your MVC, your mean corpuscular volume. A corpuscle means like a glob, and this glob that we are looking at is the red blood cell. What we're looking at is the mean, the average, red blood cell volume. How big is the average red blood cell in your body? If your red blood cells are not the correct size, like, you know, maybe the average red blood cell looks like this and yours look like this, then you're going to have less efficient oxygen transmission. You're going to have much worse things. Maybe your red blood cells are like too big, so that could lead to like blood clotting. That could lead to all sorts of things. And so those are really the major blood tests that we can do. There are a few other things that you end up doing, and a lot of these, what you would end up doing is fasting. So if you are fasting with a blood test, that means you don't eat for a specific amount of time before. And that's because, remember, things like food gets in your blood. So when they want to do things like measure your blood glucose, if you eat before that, all that glucose is going to just go straight into your blood. And when it gets in your blood, it's going to throw off all the levels. So they're trying to get like a baseline amount of how much glucose is inside your blood. So really, this is something like a blood glucose test. They're looking for how much sugar is in your blood, and that is going to help them diagnose things like diabetes. It's It's going to help them diagnose really like hormone function and know how well your body is working with glucose. Calcium is another major thing that they're going to look for. The amount of calcium helps them look at how well your kidneys are working, helps them look at how well your bones are uptaking and breaking down bone. Another major indicator is hormone disorders. One thing, I don't know if you remember, is the thyroid had a major role. The thyroid and the parathyroid have major roles in calcium adsorption into the bones. And so that could be one indicator that they're looking for there. It could be an indicator of cancer as well, and it could be an indicator of malnutrition. So they're really just kind of looking at, do you have the right amount of calcium? And because calcium is used in specific places in the body, it helps them diagnose those things. Okay, another major thing they're going to look at are electrolytes. Electrolytes are solutions that carry or that conduct electricity. And so an electrolyte is just a solution that conducts electricity. So like, when they talk about Gatorade is full of electrolytes. Really, Gatorade is just sugar and salt dissolved in water. You can make your own homemade Gatorade. You can just like squeeze orange juice with salt and sugar and add enough water and just balance it out until it tastes good. Basically what they're looking for is things like your amount of sodium, your potassium, your chlorine. These are huge indicators of nerve function because the action potential of your nerves depends on the movement of these ions in your blood. It helps you figure out how well your nerves are working. It can also show you things like hydration, and it might be an indicator that some of your organs are starting to fail as well. So they'll often look for this. And so one thing they end up doing is they look for things like hyper or hypokalemia. So emia is presence in blood. Cal refers to potassium. And if you know your periodic table, you know that potassium has the symbol K. And they might also look at things like natremia. And that comes from natrium. Natrium is sodium, which, if you know your periodic table, is Na. So they really are just kind of looking for these different things to find out what's going on. Another major thing they end up doing is looking at your kidney function. And since your kidneys are able to produce or basically filter out the urea, that's what makes urine, they can look for how much of that is in your blood. If the blood urea nitrogen, like the amount of urea in your blood is really high, probably means your kidneys aren't filtering it really well. And kidney function is super important. If your kidneys don't work, then you die. So they need to filter out that waste so that your body doesn't become toxic. And so if your kidneys stop working, that's a huge indicator. So people who are in the hospital, they monitor kidney function quite closely to make sure that they're doing okay. If anything starts to slip, and the first major indicator of that, well, maybe not the first, but a major indicator of that is your blood urea nitrogen. Ooh, still going. Now, what we're looking at here are enzymes and lipids. So enzyme tests and lipid tests. Enzyme and lipid tests help you actually figure out some different functions and maybe some indicators of breakdown. So remember, enzymes work inside of cells, and so we can figure out how cells are functioning based on if this is in the blood. So troponin is a muscle protein, and it is pretty high in cardiac muscle. And so if there is damage to cardiac muscle tissue, troponin will leak into the bloodstream. If there is high troponin levels, it's a high indicator that you had a heart attack. And so basically, if you have muscle or heart damage, then they can look for this in your blood and basically figure out if you had a heart attack. So if you had a mild heart attack and you went into the hospital, you maybe not like be in resuscitation or anything. You might be able to recover from it, and they'll check to see if there is troponin inside of your blood. If there is, chances are you had a heart attack. Another thing they'll look for is what's called CK. CK is creatine kinase. And this is a protein, but it is a protein from just general muscle tissue. And it is kind of like a jagged little protein. And so if it is going through your body, it will eventually have to be filtered out by your kidneys. And if you have really high levels of CK, it can basically like scratch and damage and block the inside of your kidneys. So it can be really dangerous if it's in very high levels. But basically it's an indicator of if somebody had muscle damage, if your muscles are starting to break down, or again, if you've had a heart attack because you have muscle tissue in your heart. So it's really just looking at muscle damage. The more muscle damage, the higher the amount of CK that's going to be in your blood. All right, cholesterol. You know, I don't think we ever talked about what cholesterol does. Cholesterol manufactures hormones. That's actually what it does. So, well, and I shouldn't even say manufactures. It is turned into hormones. That is really the major role of cholesterol. Now, there are not a lot of people who are at levels of dangerously low cholesterol, but it does mean that cholesterol has to be moved through your body. This conversion happens inside the liver. And so your body will have like a little shipment system between the blood and the liver. If you need to manufacture hormones, it will ship cholesterol to the liver. So this is to make hormones. If it needs to deliver those to other places, then it will like ship them out into the blood. And so you kind of have this like system going on that's kind of exchanging things back and forth, but really you can measure the high density lipids and the low density lipids and the total cholesterol, and it's a really good indication of heart health. So you can basically look at artery health by looking at the amount of cholesterol. You can also find out a little bit about liver health through this. So it's a really good indication of those things. And then triglycerides. Whew, I don't know if you remember this from nutrition, but triglycerides were those little molecules that had 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol. That is why it is a triglyceride. It's basically the amount of fat inside of your blood. Really high amounts of triglycerides is really dangerous because it is going to, some of that's going to get converted into cholesterol, some of that is going to build up in your body. If it's really, really high amounts, it can do liver damage because that's where you end up storing some of it, and you end up storing it in fat cells as well. So, you know, it's a good indication of diet and health as well. All right, okay, I'm done talking about that. Sorry to make you listen to me explain every blood test that you can get, but that is not every blood thing that you can get. There's lots. But here is a good thing to keep in mind, is that you are going to get your blood taken by a phlebotomist. They're going to send it to a lab, and then the lab is going to have a lab technician actually analyze this stuff. The lab technician creates a report, and then that report is sent to a doctor. So I know we think like doctors are kind of the be-all end-all here, but there's a lot of stuff going on. So basically your doctor does the analysis, they have their hypothesis, they need some data, and so then they ship you to a phlebotomist who is specialized in taking blood. The phlebotomist will then give this to a lab tech who is specialized in chemical techniques. They will produce their report and give that to the doctor, and then the doctor is able to interpret it and then do some analysis. It is not up to the lab tech to make a decision and be like, okay, this guy has hemophilia. That's not their job. Their job is just to make the report, put out the numbers, and it's the doctor's job to look at it. Everybody has a range essentially that is considered to be healthy. So I know we talked about like a healthy blood pressure is, 120 over 80 or 120 over 90, but really that's like there's a plus or minus here. It can be close to that and still be okay. And the same thing goes for all of your chemical diagnostics. You'll notice things here like, there's a lot of hormones listed here, but let's say CK. So here is CK right here. That's CK for a female. Here is CK for a male. And look at the amounts that are okay. It's basically okay to be between, 30 microliters and a lot, almost 200 microliters. And it changes, it's even greater a range if you're a male. Now, really, you want to be somewhere in the middle of this range. It's probably more ideal. But, if you're on the low end, you're still at least in a healthy range, but it's something to be aware of. So it's not like one specific number is good and one is bad. It's more about having a spectrum of these things and understanding where you fit on there. All right, maybe the least invasive test you could ever do is urinalysis. And that is peeing in a cup and letting them test your urine. So urinalysis may sound super gross, but because urine is an excrement, then it means that you can actually test how well your excretory system is working. It's a really good indicator of a lot of things, because you can look at things like how well your carbohydrates were broken down, how well your liver is working, how well your kidney is working, as well as how well you are balanced in terms of like acids and bases. And it could even help you indicate things like kidney stones. And one of the major things we do is we also use it to diagnose urinary tract infections. So think about your kidneys. So you got your kidneys, and then they have their ureters. The ureters drain into the bladder, and then the bladder drains out the urethra. And so a urinary tract infection is when bacteria start living in your urinary tract, in your urethra, or in your bladder. Severe cases, those bacteria will climb up and make their way into your kidneys. This looks like I drew an alien, but that is your excretory system. So really, these are really quite common in females. So it can be a really good indicator of things happening there. But you can also use this to determine pregnancy, and part of that is because some hormones are released through the urine. And so hormones change during pregnancy, and you can actually figure out if somebody is pregnant based on the hormones that are being excreted through their urine. All right, two of the major things that we look at are the turbidity. Okay, turbidity is cloudiness. So this is how cloudy is your urine. How cloudy should it be? Not. That's how cloudy it should be. We also check it for color. And so color can be an indication of a lot of things, but really we're not looking at like how light or how dark that color is. We're looking for like, is it red? Does it have blood? Is it yellow like it's supposed to be? And you can basically determine maybe some kidney issues quickly based off that. Cloudiness is almost always caused by the presence of bacteria, and you do not want bacteria living in your bladder. That is a urinary tract infection, and it needs to be treated. So you get antibiotics, which will kill that bacteria and be able to fix that. But this is a huge indication of bladder health, urinary tract health, and your kidney health. Other things that we can do is we can actually test some of the chemicals in it, and this is like I think it's so amazing that we can do this, but there's actually literally just strips, urinalysis strips, and they're color-coded. There's different things on there, and each of those colors is testing something different. You dip it in the urine, it changes color, and you can actually figure out what's going on. That's so crazy. Blows my mind that we can do that. Another thing that they can do is they can look at the actual solids inside of your urine. I know you don't think there's solids, but there's like tiny little dissolved, tiny little crystallized things inside there. So what they do is they centrifuge it. Basically, they spin it at extremely high rates, and then that tube filled with urine, all the solids will sink to the will be pushed to the outside. You collect those, you put them on a microscope slide. Here's my microscope slide. So you spread them onto your microscope slide, and then you're able to actually look and see what's going on. Might be able to actually see bacteria. Maybe you can identify them not as bacteria, but as yeast, which would be an indication of a yeast infection. Maybe there are other cells inside of there, which is probably not good. You can look at crystals and crystal size. This might be an indication of like kidney stones. And that could be an indication of some diet issues or some acid-base balance. And there might also be parasites. Things want to live inside of you and off of you. So, you know, it's possible that you have parasites living inside of your urinary tract. And so you can detect those using microscopic analysis. Something else we can do are bacterial cultures. So we make a plate, and this plate has a substance on it that's called agar. It's basically kind of like Jello. It's not actually Jello. You can't do this with Jello, but this is a similar idea. And the bacteria can eat it and live off of it and live inside of it, but they can't move very well. And so they're able to grow. You can see like this is area of bacterial growth. And then we can actually test them and find out what kinds of bacteria you have. Maybe you have bacteria that are antibiotic resistant, which means we can't kill them with antibiotics, which means we can't kill them. And so we can actually test and find out resistant. We can find out what's going on by testing some of these things. We can also stain them, so we can like change the color of them. That really helps us figure out what kinds of bacteria we are dealing with. Another major thing that we do is what's called a histopathology. And a histopathology is when we actually collect cells or tissues and then we study them. And that can help us to figure out if some of those cells or tissues are growing improperly. So this is a sample of a gallbladder. Basically, it's been placed on a microscope slide, and they're looking at the cells of it and trying to figure out, are those cells healthy? Is there something wrong in the structure? Maybe is there cancer or something like that? And this is a major way that we can diagnose things. One of the most common histopathologies is called a pap smear, where we actually collect cells from the cervix. And then that is able to give us an idea of cervix health, particularly cervical cancer. It sounds incredibly painful, but we literally just, somebody goes in, they collect cells by essentially scraping cells off of the cervix. And then they're able to check that. And it's incredibly important to get done because it helps actually identify cancers in early stages if you get checked regularly. And so then it can be treated. But cervical cancer is quite common and can be caused by certain STIs, particularly the human papillomavirus, HPV. And so it can be, it's really important to get checked. And so there's lots of different types of histopathologies to check different things, but that's essentially what we do. Collect cells, look at them, figure them out, and find out how to treat it. Something else that can be done is a biopsy. And a biopsy is when we actually, this is an invasive procedure, meaning we go inside the body. And so what we would do is go inside of the body. I can't talk and write at the same time. So you go inside of the body, usually with a needle or a small tool to collect pieces of something. And then you would be able to actually collect a sample of that organ. You can then use lots of different techniques to check the health of the cells in there. So really you're looking to see, like, do you have cancers? Do you have diseases? Is something infectious? Essentially what happened is they probably detected on another type of diagnostic that something looked wrong. And so a biopsy is kind of like just checking to see what's going on internally to make sure everything's okay. All right, this was something we looked at yesterday, was this patient. This patient came in and they had all these issues. We kind of got to the point where we diagnosed them as possibly having something like a heart condition. And so if we think about what are some chemical diagnostics that we want to run, hopefully one thing you have realized, I guess we should mention, we knew this because of blood pressure, heart rate, and high respiratory rate. All of those were high and made us worry about heart health. If you were to think about further diagnostics, I hope you immediately thought blood test. And then if we think blood test, let's think about some of the things we can actually test for. If somebody's heart health is our biggest concern, we could look at something like a CBC. It's really common that this would probably be ordered anyway just to check, but really heart health has a lot to do with more of the other things that we may want to look at. Chances are here, a good thing to look for would be troponin. Remember, troponin is used to check for heart attack. CK helps us look for muscle damage. So again, heart attack could be something we look for. A good thing you're probably going to want to look for are triglyceride levels. Thinking about the health of this patient, and we talked about how they were overweight, they have the high blood pressure. We maybe want to figure out triglyceride levels, and I think cholesterol are probably also good indicators of things that you want to look for, right? And so those can be all things that you want to examine. Maybe you even want to look for something like the platelets, because maybe if their blood is clotting, maybe that'll be something that you want to deal with if they're having issues with their heart. You don't want to have any things like strokes pop up. So those can be all things that you really go for. Non-invasive procedures to really take a look at and see the health of this person based on the vital signs that we took and based on the initial observation that we had. So again, super long lesson, sorry, but at least now when you go to the doctor and they give you the big sheet and you have to go to like the place, the phlebotomist, now you kind of have an idea what's going on. So thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.